Hello everyone, it's me again. Today we're going to talk about shooting modes. Shooting modes can be taken one of two ways. You can make it complicated, you can make it really simple. It can seem complicated because there's so many different options, but there's only really a few that you need to worry about. Let's go through it now and get to grips with what's important in shooting modes and what's not. This is shooting mode. Enjoy. Okay, what a camera's shooting modes are: giving the user the ability to give or take control from the camera itself when rendering an image. A camera's primary job is to gather light and render an image. We've been through that process before. We've been through what makes up light. We've been through what allows light in and how much light is allowed in through shutter speed, through aperture, and through ISO. We've been through how the sensor deals with light, how those photons are converted into voltage, then code, and then an image. So essentially you have control over the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture, but you do get to give the camera a certain amount of control if you want to, and this is what shooting modes are: giving or taking control from yourself or the camera. Let's have a look at where they're found. In most cameras, they're on the top dial, the main dial, deciding which shooting mode you want to be in. Quite often cameras will come with a number of different shooting modes: portrait, landscape, auto, sport mode. To be greatly honest, if you've taken this course, you need to get off all these modes, especially auto. The problem with the camera is it does not have a creative instinct. Under perfect conditions, you could get the result you want under these modes, but because the camera is trying to calculate too much, you're often going to be disappointed, especially when the light conditions get challenging. The camera just can't think for itself, and cameras never will. If you're at this stage in your photographic career and you want to get better than this, there's only 4 modes you need to worry about right now, and you need to be on, and you never need to worry about any of the others. It's that simple. That is simplifying shooting modes. But let's get into each one of them specifically. The first one is often represented by the symbol AV, or simply A, and this is called aperture priority, which means you have control, and the camera, according to those settings and your exposure compensation, will decide what shutter speed it needs to create the correct exposure. The second shooting mode you need to worry about is shutter priority, which might be represented as TV or simply S. And what this does is give you, the cameraman, the user, control over the shutter speed and the ISO, and the camera will determine the aperture. You've got control over 2 elements of the triangle of light, the exposure triangle, and the camera has 1. The next one is manual mode with auto ISO. Quite often people confuse this with full manual. People say, oh, I shoot in full manual. And then I say, oh, what are your ISO settings? And they go, oh no, my ISO is on auto. That's not manual. I'm afraid it's not. I don't know what that's called, ISO priority, but it's not manual. It is a great shooting mode, but it's not manual. The camera has control over ISO, which means the camera still has control over one of the elements which is equally as important as the other 2. You have control over the shutter speed and you have control over the aperture. The last shooting mode is manual mode. Now manual is full manual. You have got full control over the exposure of your image. You control the ISO, you can control the aperture, and you control the shutter speed. There is one more mode called program mode, which we're not going to go into too much now. The camera has a little bit too much control, but it is useful for one thing in particular, and that is day-night time lapses. We're not going into movie making in this video, so we'll leave that one for another time. What you need to focus on now is aperture priority, shutter priority, manual with auto ISO, and manual. Too many photographers out there who say that one mode is better than the other, that you should be shooting in aperture priority or you should be shooting in manual priority. That's just the ego of photographers wanting to claim that they have the best way. To be quite frank, there is no best way. Whatever you're comfortable with is your best way. What I can suggest is stick to what you know, but be open to what you don't know. In a more common scene, maybe dabble with the idea there could be a better mode for you to shoot on. Let's have a look at certain scenes and see why a certain mode would be better in that scene. The aperture priority mode. Remember, aperture not only deals with how much light's coming through, it deals with what's in focus, how much is in focus, the depth of field. Some might say this is your storytelling function. Many photographers, including myself, will often stay in aperture priority. Even if you don't know what you're doing, 80% of the time, you're going to get a good image. What's nice about this mode, you can quickly decide what you want to focus and what you don't want to focus. If you have a single subject and you want to blur out the background, you roll your aperture ring and you adjust f2.8. If you have a big scene and you want details all the way through the image, you quickly roll your aperture in f12, f16, f18. If you have just a lot of subjects in a particular place and you just need a little bit more depth of field, f8, f9, again, you just roll your aperture ring. You are telling your story at the roll of one finger and one dial. Once you get used to it, remember in aperture priority, your camera has control over your shutter speed, which is very important. With these zebra and crocodile, there's going to be a lot of movement. The shutter speed needs to be very fast. With these running wildebeest, the shutter speed needs to be very fast. But in time, you get to understand the relationship between certain apertures and certain ISOs, and you will know what your shutter speed is. And at a quick glance, you'll be able to make sure that it's fast enough. With shutter priority is also a commonly used mode, and where it's really good is where your shutter speed is something that cannot change. Let's look at a few examples of this. Quite often you're surprised by a situation like this, where you've got a sprinting animal, a very fast moving subject. It could be a car, it could be a plane, it could be an animal. If you know that you're about to face a situation like this, an animal sprinting for its prey, a cheetah can run at 110 kilometers an hour, you're going to need a lot of shutter speed. If you have time, change onto shutter priority. What's a sprinting cheetah? Minimum of 1600th of a second. You fix it there, and then your other settings don't really matter. But that's what you need for a sprinting cheetah. The other time this shooting mode comes in handy is when you're creating art, your pan blur. Love to pan blur. It's such a beautiful way of creating art. When we're emphasizing movement, we blur lines on purpose. Every situation when you're doing this method is different, but they all have one thing in common, is the shutter speed needs to be slow enough in order for the lines to blur, and just fast enough that you actually come out of that scene with a keepable image. You could have zebra running into a watering hole at last light. What does a running zebra need? 1/60th of a second is a good shutter speed to have. You go on shutter priority, you fix your shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. Lots of elephants moving around at dusk. Very slow movement, but you want to blur the lines, you want to create something beautiful. What do I need? 1/5 of a second. It needs to be very slow. You fix your shutter speed. If you're on aperture priority, it's going to change. There's going to be differences in light. One moment you get 1/5 of a second, one moment you get 1/20th of a second. 1/20th of a second, it's too fast. It's not going to work. It might drop down to less than a second. It might drop down to a second, which is too slow. In a situation like this, you need to fix your shutter speed, where shutter priority is going to come in handy. Manual with auto ISO is a really good shooting mode. Personally, I sometimes shoot on manual with auto ISO. It's a great shooting mode. Whether you shoot on that or aperture priority, it's up to you. Doesn't really matter, whichever one you're used to. But it gives you control over shutter speed, and it gives you control over aperture. Remember what we've talked about with aperture priority and shutter priority? Now you've got control of both. The only thing you don't need to worry about is ISO. And then we have full manual. A lot of people say, why would you go full manual? The thing you've got to consider and know about full manual is you've got 3 things now that you have to adjust according to each scene: the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed. Quite simply, there is one problem with that, and that is time. If you're shooting studio subjects and you've got time on your side, full manual is great. I started my career shooting full manual. It is amazing. You get to know how your camera works and exactly why it does certain things. The problem is when you get into situations where you don't have a lot of time, where the environment is changing. A leopard can go from walking calmly through the undergrowth to sprinting after an animal in the open plains in a matter of seconds, and you'll have to adjust all 3 settings accordingly. And quite often, and I did a lot of this in the beginning, I fumbled those settings, and you ruined a perfectly good image because you couldn't change your manual settings quick enough. You forgot about one of the 3. If you're going to use manual, you better be quick if you're going to be in a situation where the scene can change, the light conditions can change, such as wildlife photography. There is a time where manual is imperative in very challenging light conditions, where the light is actually too erratic for the camera to get the exposure right. If the camera has control over one of those points of the exposure triangle, it's going to fumble it. It's going to be too inconsistent. And the best example of this is astrophotography, shooting the night sky. There's not enough light out there, and the camera simply can't comprehend it. So you have to take full control of the camera in order to get the image right. Another great example of this is when using a spotlight in wildlife photography. The spotlight changes all the time. ethical ranges are keeping the light out of the animal's eye, so the light's going all over the place. 1 minute it's dark, 1 minute it's light. If your camera's got control over one of those three aspects of the exposure triangle, you're going to get a vast arrangement of images, and most of them are not going to be usable. You need to fix your camera in a particular setting that will get the best out of the best moments of that scene. So you have to switch to full manual. So that's shooting modes. I hope that makes sense. If you're unsure, sit on aperture priority. It will work, but you need to understand what each one of these modes mean. It's as simple as giving the camera control over some things or nothing in case of manual, and giving yourself control over some aspects of the exposure triangle. You never want to get out of any one of the modes that I've just mentioned. Stay away from auto, stay away from all the others. Focus on these four. I hope you enjoyed. See you next time.